As Walter indicated, the title of my talk today is Black-White Earnings Gap Among Restaurant Servers, Consumer Discrimination and Tipping Behaviors. So, most of the literature on everyday discrimination has focused on, in the service sector in particular, and consumption markets more generally, has focused on consumers being the victims of racial discrimination. And that is in fact where most of my research has been focused on over the last 6 years. So I've primarily been interested in looking at restaurant servers' proclivities to discriminate against customers of color. So this project here deviates from that focus in that this project looks at consumers as being the perpetrators of racial discrimination. So in this particular project, I'm not concerned with servers being the perpetrators, but rather I want to explore how consumers contribute to racial inequities in their roles as consumers. Excuse me. And the literature in this area is quite scarce, primarily because it is difficult to empirically assess the effects of consumer discrimination on study outcomes or the effects of consumer discrimination towards producing inequities among service providers according to race. And this is because it's really difficult to isolate the effects of consumer discrimination. To do so, we'd have to control for employee level characteristics like education, race. We'd also have to control for establishment, environmental characteristics. And finally, we'd have to be able to ascertain information about the consumers themselves. So being able to piece all these different pieces of the puzzle together in one study is very difficult. So consumer discrimination, even though it was said by Becker in his book on the economics of discrimination, he argued that consumer discrimination would really be the last form of discrimination because market forces would push out employer discrimination and employee discrimination. So even though this has widely been assumed to be an issue, it has not been empirically scrutinized to date for those very reasons that I mentioned. So most of the studies that do assess consumer discrimination have done so indirectly. And they've done so by looking at the percentage or the proportion of the customer base that is minority on study outcomes. So for instance, research has found a relationship between the percent of an establishment's customers who are black and the odds that an African American would be hired in that field. Similar studies have been done with regard to other employment-related outcomes like promotion and salary. So, such differential hiring practices by employers is said to reflect in part consumers' preferences for same-race employees. For instance, Ray Daner was known to discourage the hiring of too many African Americans, and Daner himself admitted that in attempting to identify reasons for underperformance, he would probably have said that in this neighborhood there's a lot of white folks and we have a considerable amount of black employees and this might be a problem. For those of you who are not familiar with Ray Daner, and there's no really reason why most of you would be familiar, he was the CEO of Denny's prior to the lawsuit that was levied and eventually won, alleging discriminatory hiring practices and really racial discrimination in a variety of different forms. So he was a major player leading up to that litigation. So similar strands of research that has indirectly looked at consumer discrimination has found things like people tend to view country clubs less positively the more ethnic minorities they employ. People tend to purchase homes in neighborhoods whose racial composition matches that of their own. People prefer to be checked out by cashiers of their own race over cashiers of a different race. And people respond more favorably to advertisements with same-race models as opposed to opposite-race models. So all these studies are kind of within the realm of this consumer discrimination, and they all otherwise suggest that consumers discriminate based on this underlying, whether it is an explicit or implicit preference for same-race employees, such that employees of color end up coming out less well than their white counterparts. The only place where consumer discrimination has really been assessed directly is in the area of sports economics. So this is the literature where consumer discrimination really has been developed. And the reason this is the case is because it's really one of the only areas wherein employee level variables, in this case the athletes level variables, can be easily ascertained. So you can easily figure out what athletes' skill is by looking at their performance statistics. And we can hold those constant when trying to ascertain whether consumer discrimination exists and to the degree it exists. That, coupled with the fact that under most conditions in the sports economics area, the consumer is the sole actor. So the researchers can easily isolate the explanatory effects of consumer bias and discrimination from other sources of mistreatment. So the consumer is the sole actor in deciding whether they watch certain athletic teams on TV, whether they go to certain athletic events. Consumers is the only actor deciding what sports cards to buy, and to the degree that sports cards are valued in accordance with demand, then that would allow us to glean some insights into potential consumer discrimination. So this body of literature is quite extensive, and it's produced very interesting but mixed results depending on the outcome being studied. But the problem is that it's a very niched area of inquiry, and it doesn't have a lot of implications beyond the sports economics market. Furthermore, with few exceptions, consumer discrimination in the sports market does not have any direct adverse effects on the providers of service, or in this case, entertainment. So in other words, if a sports card is valued lower, controlling for the athlete's accomplishments as a result of the athlete's race, then that may result in some lost revenue for the owners of the sports card company that would have otherwise been secured in the absence of consumer discrimination. But the athlete, him or mostly him, but maybe herself, is not going to have any experience any adverse effect because of that discrimination. So there's not much applied application in it, and the number of people that would be affected by consumer discrimination in this market is very, very small. Recently, however, a promising body of research on consumer racial discrimination has emerged around the custom of tipping. So, like many consumer behaviors in the sports market, tipping service providers is discretional, and the sole actor involved is, of course, the actual consumer. Unlike consumer behaviors in the sports market, however, tipping in the U.S. is a pervasive economic behavior. So, there's virtually nobody that can escape the institution of tipping, whether you are the tippee or the tipper or both. In essence, everybody interacts with this institution on some level. So for instance, 90% of the adult population eat out at least once a month. Nearly all of these individuals leave a gratuity of some sort at the end of the service encounter. Furthermore, there are over 30 tip-dependent professions above and beyond servers, wherein the recipients of these, and many of these recipients are racial minorities. In fact, there are 1.3 million African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and Latinos working as servers, bartenders, barbers, hairstylists, cosmetologists, or taxi cab drivers in the U.S. alone. And all of these individuals are vulnerable to economic loss by way of consumer racial discrimination and tipping. So in other words, to the degree that consumers tip differently according to the race of the servers, then all of these individuals are vulnerable to economic loss as a result of consumer discrimination. So although tipping is ideal in salient context to study the causes and consequences of consumer discrimination, surprisingly only 2 studies have adequately assessed the effects of service providers' race on customers' tipping decisions. So those 2 studies include Aries et al. Piece that was published in 2005 in the Yale Law Journal, and a piece by my collaborator Michael Lynn and his colleagues that was published in 2008 in the Journal of Applied Social Psych. So these are the only 2 studies that have adequately looked at consumer discrimination, racial discrimination, and tipping. So what I want to do briefly before I present my study is review these two previous studies and kind of show you where the literature, how the literature is evolving. So in the areas et al. Piece, they analyzed data derived from 1,000 customer gratuities given to taxi cab drivers in the New Haven, Connecticut area. And they found that black drivers were given significantly smaller tips than were white drivers, and this was true for both white and black customers. So this study got a lot of attention for several reasons. First and foremost, it was the first study to document consumer racial discrimination in tipping. But its findings also deviated from the common pattern that consumers prefer same race service providers, such that they found that both black and white customers tended to tip black servers less than they otherwise tipped white servers. So these were two findings that warranted a lot of attention and provoked a lot of thought. The researchers controlled for a host of factors that have otherwise been shown to be predictive of tipping. So they were able to control for factors like did the customer have luggage? Did the customer, was the customer alone, or was the customer with a group? Was the customer female or male? Did the customer travel a long distance in the cab versus short distance? But one thing they weren't able to control for was service quality. So this was a pretty major shortcoming in this study because it remained possible that the seller race effect, or in this case the driver race effect, rather than reflecting consumer discrimination, it could have been reflecting differences in service skills. So in the event that black taxi cab drivers were providing a lower level of perceived service than their white driving counterparts, you'd expect to see this disparity in tipping emerge. So, given that possibility, obviously the next step was to try to replicate these findings and extend this study by including a measure of service quality. And that's what Michael Lynn and his colleagues did. So in 2008, they published a study that resulted from the analysis of 140 tips given to restaurant servers working in a full-service restaurant in the southern region of the U.S. In this case, they included a measure of service skills constructed from customers' holistic ratings of their servers' appearance, friendliness, attentiveness, and promptness. So these dimensions of service were included into a single index that was used to proxy service skills possessed by black servers and white servers. The authors found that net of the effects of service skills, both black and white restaurant patrons tipped black servers less than they did white servers. So, these findings not only replicate the areas et al. Piece that was done in upstate with taxicab drivers, but it also replicated the finding that both black and white consumers were discriminated in their tipping decisions based on the race of the service provider. And in this case, this difference was shown not to be explained by racial differences in service skills, right? Proxied by customers' rating of their service provider, in this case, restaurant servers. So, we're beginning to think that there's something here, although we're still thinking that it's only two studies. In this particular study done with restaurant servers, as you can see, it was a sample of 140, so it was quite small. All right, so you kind of have a background on where the literature is and where this particular study stems from. So the current study is in response to the lack of existing research in this area. And in this particular study, we aim to advance this literature in several ways. First, we just wanted to try to replicate again, for the third time, actually the second time, the Aries et al. And the Lynn et al. Finding, although we wanted to do it in a different region, in a different sample, using, in this case, a larger sample. But more importantly, the primary contribution offered by this particular piece is an elaboration of the obvious critique or response to this discrepancy that has been documented with regard to customers' tipping decisions, and that being that we're still not adequately measuring racial differences in service skills, right? So my thinking on the issue was that to really move forward, we have to rule out that there are not differences in the way, racial differences in the way servers are administering service. Once we rule that out, I think that it eliminates that critique and we can put forth more concerted efforts towards understanding the effect. So the primary contribution is to explore the mediating effects of service skills in the relationship between servers' race and customers' tipping by including in our analysis indicators of nuanced hospitality enhancing server behaviors. And I'll talk a little bit more about this momentarily. But we also want to take an exploratory approach. So we want to begin to explore the boundaries of this effect. So in an attempt to do so, we look at basically every interaction that we can think of that might shed some light on this seller race effect. And we do so in a very exploratory way, just to begin to understand if the effect is limited to certain demographics or if it's limited to certain conditions within the context of the service encounter. And then finally we want to contribute by offering directions for future research. So this has a dimension of the project is in essence just to encourage research in this area given the lack of existing research. So going back to the primary contribution, which is to further explore the mediating effects of service skills in the relationship between servers' race and customers' tipping decision. Recall that the Len et al. Study was the first study to include service skills. So he did so by controlling for service skills using holistic indicators of service quality. So as I mentioned, he used these holistic indicators that were constructed from customers' rating of their server's promptness, attentiveness, friendliness, and appearance. So those are quite generic, right? In addition to those holistic measures, we also include in this study measures comprised from subjects' reports of subtle cues of hospitality that are either conventionally required, such as did the server smile, did the server maintain eye contact, or those that are optional and thus rare. Did the server joke around with you? Did the server make you laugh? So adding these subtle indicators of service to the equation, if you will, is important because these nuanced server behaviors have been shown to be better predictors of customers' tipping decisions than the more holistic indicators of service quality. But also more importantly is that research has found that non-white servers are less likely than their white counterparts to exhibit some of these behaviors during service encounters, particularly upselling techniques, telling jokes or stories, complimenting food choices, or squatting down the next table. So these types of service behaviors have been shown to vary systematically by the race of the server. So to the degree that this is occurring, you might expect again that there is a racial difference in tipping according to the server's race as a result of these differences in server or service behaviors. So the primary goal is to basically rule out this obvious critique, that this is what's going on, or to assess it. So the data comes from an exit survey that was conducted locally, and customers were approached after stepping out of a moderately priced restaurant and asked if they would be willing to complete a short questionnaire about their dining experience that evening. So the questionnaire was one page. It, in essence, asked them a series of questions to glean insight into whether the server conveyed to them these subtle, conventionally required service behaviors, these subtle, usually quite rare or optional service behavior, and then we also had measures of these holistic measures of service quality. And then of course some demographics. So 128 customers were solicited, 515 agreed to participate, so 63% of those solicited actually participated in the study. However, after deleting missing data, parties of 6 or more, we deleted those because those parties had automatic gratuity added to their bill. And then we deleted 46 additional subjects who were determined to be disengaged. So these folks filled out my questionnaire much like many students fill out end of the year evaluations. They just went straight through and just did as fast as they could. So we had built into the survey. We had a mechanism to detect those people, so they were likewise eliminated. So I ended up with 378 customers in the sample that was actually analyzed for this study. Give you a little bit of background on the measures. The dependent measure, the primary dependent measure is tip percentage, although we also predict in the mediation analysis, we also predict the mediating variables. So when I talk about mediating variables, again, I'm talking about the 3 different measures of service skills or service quality. Service quality being used as a proxy for server skills. So the first one we label service quality, and this is the exact same measure that Lynn et al. Used in the published 2008 study in Journal of Applied Social Psych. And then we include an index comprised of recommending food items, complimenting food choices, and joking or making laugh. We label these rare service behaviors or optional service behaviors. And then we also have an index comprised of, did your server smile at you? Did they give their name? Did they maintain correct posture, eye contact? Did they thank you after the meal? Did they make you feel comfortable? Or did they make you feel like they were being inconvenienced? Met expectations, seemed authentic. So all these are considered subtle, conventionally required service behaviors, and thus we labeled this subtle service behaviors. So that's the primary variables that I'm interested in looking at here. Of course, in addition to the server's race, right? So those mediating variables and tipping, and then server's race. These are the control or moderating variables. They're control variables in the main analysis, and then they become moderating variables in the exploratory analysis. So we control for customers' age, customers' education, income, gender, customers' race, how frequently they went to this restaurant, their bill size, their dining party size, their server's gender, and then their ratings of the atmosphere as well as the food. Right? Atmosphere as well as the food. So for an exit survey, we have a pretty good set of control variables. All right. So here's what we find. If you zero in on the very last row, this is the server race effect. So in this case, what we're doing is comparing black servers with white servers. There was a handful, I should have noted, there was a handful of servers who were identified to be something other than white or black, and those individuals were recoded as black, given the fact that I knew that there was no one in the restaurant that self-identified as anything other than white or black. And there was also some discrepancies in terms of the customer's race. There was not discrepancies, I guess, but there was roughly 40, I believe, individuals who identified as being another race. So in the interaction analysis and the moderation analysis, we exclude those folks as well. So I forgot to mention that. All right, so if we zero in on this server black effect, we see that when predicting tip percent, that there is a negative effect, thus suggesting that black servers are tipped less than their white counterparts. And then in the last 3 columns, we predict rare service behaviors, subtle service behaviors, and service quality. So these are our 3 indicators of server skills. If server skills, in these more nuanced indicators of server skills, did in fact explain the negative effect of being black on tips garnered, then we should see an effect of being black, a significant effect of being black on these service skills, or indicators of service skills. And in fact, that effect should be negative, right? Because it would suggest that customers are perceiving black servers to deliver inferior service. As a result, black and white customers, or in this case we haven't shown that, but as a result, customers are tipping them less. So as you can see, just by paying attention to the stars and the asterisks and whatnot, we have a significant effect on tipping being black, but there are no statistically significant effects on these indicators of server skills. And to the degree that there are racial differences, these findings suggest that black servers are perceived to provide higher quality service relative to their white server counterpart. So to the degree that there are differences in service skills possessed by black servers and white servers, these findings would suggest that black servers have more skills or are better at their jobs than white servers. And again, this is from the perspective of the customers who are responsible for paying their wages in the form of tips. So we do not find support for this, this notion of service skills mediating the relationship between servers' race and customers' tipping decisions. In fact, when we include all of these indicators of server skills into a model predicting percent tip, as you would expect, the disparity or discrepancy between white and black servers actually increases as opposed to decreasing, right? So holding service quality constant, there is a bigger discrepancy in the tips garnered by black servers relative to their white counterparts. So in the moderation analysis, first and foremost, what we did in the exploratory analysis, first and foremost, we interacted servers' race with customers' race to see if we could replicate the earlier study by areas done with taxi cab drivers and then the earlier study done by Lynn with restaurant servers. And we found that the product term was not significant. So that suggested that both black and white customers tip black servers less than white servers, which is consistent with those previous two studies. We also interacted servers' race with basically every other variable we had in the data set, just to explore, see what we could find. And we found that none of these interaction effects were statistically significant. So the interaction effect between servers' race and customers' education wasn't significant, so the effect of servers' race was not on tipping decisions, was not predicated or conditioned by customers' education. It was the same whether one was educated or not educated. It was the same regardless of the customer's age, income, sex, patronage frequency, bill size, party size, server sex, and it was the same regardless of these proxies for server skills. We did find two significant interactions in this exploratory analysis, and those were between servers' race and food quality and atmosphere quality. So black-white server difference in tip percentage was greater the lower the customer rated the quality of the food and atmosphere. So as the perceptions of atmosphere and food decreased, the disparity in tips given to black and white servers increased. So then, just continuing with our exploration, we looked at some three-way interactions. So we looked at whether server race interacted with customers' race by atmosphere and food quality. And findings suggested that black customers but not white customers might discriminate against black servers more the less appealing they find the restaurant's food and atmosphere. All right, so these exploratory analyses, the reason I emphasize exploratory analysis is given the sample size, once we start doing three-way interactions, the cells become quite small. So the number of people in this data who were black, who had a black server, who rated their service quality low versus high, and so on and so forth, it becomes pretty small. Furthermore, there was no theoretical reason to be testing all these interaction effects. We did it, again, just to explore, provide some exploration to hopefully inform future research. But these interactions do turn out to be quite interesting, and we do draw from them in discussing our findings, and particularly we draw from them in our discussion of directions for future research. So what do we find? We find that consumer racial discrimination in tipping is not unique to specific locales. So now this is the third region that this effect has been documented in. It is also not unique to industries, so it generalizes at least, appears to generalize at least from taxi cab drivers to restaurant servers. And it also does not appear to be the result of nuanced differences in study design or execution or samples. Moreover, we find that the effect is not mediated by holistic ratings of service quality nor perceptions of nuanced hospitality-enhancing server behaviors that are either optional or conventionally required and which have been shown to positively affect tipping. To the degree that there are interracial differences in server skills, African Americans, as I mentioned, appear to be perceived to do their job slightly better than their white coworkers in this study. So we're fairly confident that this effect is real, and we're increasingly confident that it cannot be attributed to differences in the way white and black servers carry out their occupational duties. And that's basically what we know at this point, which in the scheme of things is not that much, right? Because we still haven't been able to explain what's going on. So this area is ripe with opportunities to contribute, and that's where the paper kind of ends. And so in delineating directions for future research, there's several kind of priorities, if you will. Given the fact that this is really only the third time the effect has been documented, we need to continue to not only replicate it, but see the generalizable limits of this effect. So for instance, would we observe the cellar race effect in other industries that are tip dependent? So far the only place that we've looked for it is among taxi drivers and restaurant servers. So we need to continue to look for it beyond these two specific occupations. We also need to look at it within different organizational contexts. So all the studies that have been done, the two studies that have been done in the restaurant industry are done in comparable restaurants. So they're both moderately priced, kind of family style restaurants. So there's some evidence suggesting that servers might be at a greater risk for consumer discrimination at higher priced restaurants. So that's an area of inquiry that we should explore. And we also need to move beyond black-white comparisons and begin to look to see if other service providers of color have this tip penalty levied upon them by way of consumer discrimination. And we also need to begin to research other potential explanatory mechanisms. So if it's not service skills, then the obvious question is, what's going on here? So one potentially fruitful line of inquiry in this vein is to look at the effects of implicit racial biases. So given the fact that we live in a society that's white-centered and wherein whiteness is valued, it's possible that the effects that we're documenting are as a result of people's unconscious bias towards white servers at the expense of black servers. So some of this research on implicit biases have shown that both black and white folks harbor these biases, and they become manifest in subtle ways during interaction. So that might be something that is going on. And we also need to realize or recognize the possibility that the explanatory mechanisms may differ for white customers versus black customers. So we may find that implicit biases or implicit prejudices might be a stronger explanatory mechanism when predicting the tipping decisions of white customers, whereas it's possible that we might find that when predicting black customers' tendency to tip black servers less, we might find that it's a function of their efforts to combat the common stereotype that black customers don't tip well, right? So this is one idea that I propose that should be tested, is that in the event that somebody is conscious of this stereotype, and the stereotype is pervasive enough that there's a reason to believe that plenty of African Americans are very aware of this idea that blacks don't tip as well as white people. So to the degree that they're aware of this, they may have a tendency to over-tip white servers in an attempt to combat this stereotype, whereas they might not feel as much pressure to do so when they have the same racial identity with their server as in the case with black servers. So to the degree that this is happening, what we might find is that while we have the same outcome, i.e. black servers not getting as good at tips as white servers, there may be two very distinct causal processes operating that would explain the common outcome. So that's kind of where I encourage the research to go from here. And in a nutshell, that's where the research is right now, and that's the contribution that this particular study attempts to make. At that point, I'm sure many of you have questions. Usually it's a questions, comments. And other ideas in terms of causal mechanisms or what might explain this are certainly welcome, because it's still wide open.
What other types of places tip as far as employees?
So restaurant servers are one of the largest group, and taxi cab drivers, as I mentioned, but then you have hairstylists and cosmetologists, and you have baggage folks that take care of baggage in hotel rooms, and nail folks, and there's a whole range of professions that are at least semi-reliant on tips.
I was just curious how many people in your sample actually went over the 15% rule.
Quite a few. The average tip now is closer to 20% than 15, so it's somewhere around like 18.5%.
So did you try any dichotomous views of tipping?
Tipping less than 15 versus more.
That might be interesting.
Yeah.
But I think your implicit racism is critical. I mean, we're finding that a lot in medical care.
Yeah, and I think that definitely is a strong possibility that might be going on. The difficult thing is just designing a study to actually test it. If I could get Wayne State to give me some money, maybe I would do it.
In your questionnaire, were you able to do anything in collecting information about discretionary income?
I do have measures of customers' income. Yeah, so it was had basically, I think, 4 categories, so it was quite a crude measure, but I did have some indication of income and education.
But nothing on their attitude in terms of the use of discretionary income in a recreational or leisure context?
No, nothing more specific.
Are you moving towards doing social psychological studies? But I'm thinking that it would be interesting if you had, you probably already thought about it, but I was thinking that you were talking about trying to measure this in terms of bias among whites and blacks. That if you had like a television prompter and it had like a server like providing service, and then you ask somebody, how much would you tip this person? And to one group of people you said, the average, the average person tips whatever the average percent is. Particularly for black, because they, like you said, they tip less and maybe they're less aware. And then in another script, you don't say anything at all. And so you can see maybe if it is this, people just aren't aware how much they're supposed to tip. Or perhaps the script does a better job trying to get at the idea. Think about African Americans, but trying to overcompensate. If you could come up with like a script, one, people aware that sometimes black people tip for the white people, black people for whatever reason. Another script, nothing is said, just to see is it this implicit bias or trying to overcompensate.
Yeah.
You could definitely show. And then you have another script for white to see what's going on with them as well. It seems like it could be moving in that direction in terms of trying to figure out how do you get this mediating effect? How can you observe this mediating effect?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility, but before I would do that, I would go the cheap route and try to replicate it with a large online survey. And I say that partially because Mike Lynn's really good at coordinating these large online surveys. So an idea that would be able to get at this potentially on the very cheap would be to basically give hypothetical scenarios to an online survey and then embed the IAT in the survey instrument, so make them take the implicit association test, the RACE module, and we'll see. First and foremost, we have to be able to replicate it, and there's some question whether we would be able to observe that on an online hypothetical based scenario versus an exit survey context. But that, and then the best way to do it would be to literally do the exit survey, and then as part of the exit survey, make them take the IAT on an iPad or something. But the problem is just getting customers to take 30 minutes to sit there and do research for you when they've just got done eating. I mean, I had more hands in my face like this doing this research than I've had in my whole life.
Are you giving, well, yeah, I can see that. Are you giving, you're not giving them any money or gift card or anything like that?
No, I asked for money from Wayne State and they didn't give it to me, so I blame them for that. Otherwise I would have given them a gift card.
You said that your research was done at one particular restaurant, middle of the line pricing. Have you considered maybe doing these surveys in different income areas? So maybe like doing it at restaurants within the city as opposed to doing that within a more affluent community?
Yeah.
Do you think the results might kind of vary a little bit?
Yeah, the difficult, I mean, definitely, I think that's kind of what part of my point was in terms of just seeing the generalizable limits, is do it in a lot of different contexts, not only geographical contexts, but organizational contexts. But the problem is and this is a problem with a lot of restaurants, is that, and it's a manifestation of the segregated nature of our society. So if you go out to a lot of the suburbs that are more affluent, then it tends to be really hard to get enough African Americans in the study, right? And that was part of the limitation of the earlier Lynn et al. Piece, is they only had 140 cases, and of those, there was a really small number of people in the black customer, black server cell, and that's because there was just so few African Americans in that context. So it becomes a difficult scenario in terms of getting an adequately diverse sample when you try to do it in the suburbs. So that's what's great about this area, is there is so much diversity, but in a lot of areas there's not. Like up in Ithaca where Michael Lynn is, there's pretty white. I've never been there, but he says it's pretty white.
Right.
So do they hire just people, a lot of the employers just hire their kind? I think you said that too, like people that they service.
Yeah, there is some evidence. I don't know how pervasive that is in the restaurant industry. I know that what I can speak to is that there's a good amount of evidence suggesting that, like most industries, African Americans encounter discrimination at the point of hiring for a restaurant serving position. And that's why in most restaurants you see that the restaurants themselves are very racially segregated. So there's a lot of whiteness in the front, there tends to be, and a lot of color in the back. So they literally are spatially divided in the restaurant context.
I think it'd be interesting to discover the variable, or to investigate the variable where, and this is especially true if men are doing the paying and the tipping, where physical attractiveness comes into play, where in general, both white and black people view, if this were the case, white people as more attractive than black, and if that affected the discrepancies in tipping.
Yeah, and I would think that would likely tie in with the implicit biases, right? So people have this implicit association of beauty when they're primed with whiteness and non-beauty when they're primed with color. So I think that you're right. I think that would be something interesting to explore, and I think that would help tell the story, if you will. But I'll also take this as an opportunity to also point out, this is another interesting kind of side note, is if you look at the effect of servers' gender, you see that there's a statistically significant negative effect of being female. So in this study, customers likewise tip female servers less than male servers. And we don't get into this in this particular paper, but we do note in the discussion that this could be for that reason that you spoke of, the notions of perceived attractiveness. So it could be that the specific female servers in this establishment may not have been perceived to be attractive, and it says perceived attractiveness, because there is literature showing that the servers who make the most tip are those female servers who conform to normative beauty standards. So without going into all the details of what that entails, basically what you see 90% of models on TV. So the closer that you conform to that body type, the more tips you get. So in the event that servers in this particular study were not perceived to be attractive, that could be driving this effect. And I point that out because it's in contrast to some other research that shows that actually female servers tend to get more than male servers.
Is there any way you can estimate or speak to, so it looks like from there, at least conditionally, about 1.5% less per bill. Can you talk about what would the implication be, sort of like how much servers make and then what percentage based on tips? Like, I mean, are we talking of a yearly difference of a couple $100, a couple $1,000?
I mean, you basically, I don't know what the average income would be for servers in this particular restaurant, but if I'm not mistaken, the average national server makes somewhere around $25,000 a year, and that's the vast majority of that is tips. In some restaurants, all of it is in the form of tips. So this restaurant, I suspect they're making more than that, so I wouldn't be surprised if the typical server, and this is just pure speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if the typical server in this particular study is making around $30,000 a year. So if you include the service quality measures in there, that coefficient jumps up to around 2. So 2% of 30,000.
Around $600.
Yeah. So.
Is there a question over there?
Well, I work at Olive Garden actually, and I know for a fact that I don't really get a paycheck at all. I make $2.45 an hour, so basically all the money I make is dependent on my tips, because after taxes, I don't really get any money from my paychecks.
Another thing too, I don't think that everybody knows that we get paid that much.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So, no paycheck, no paycheck.
Mhm.
What are we going home with if you're not tipping us?
Because
Yeah.
in Canada, servers get paid minimum wage, so Canadians tend to tip less because their servers get paid minimum wage, so they come here and don't tend to tip us,
Even
but we're
in
only
Europe?
making $2 an hour.
Yeah, that's actually the case in most societies. There's no place other than the U.S. where tipping is so entrenched into the culture. So it is a unique context.
I'm sorry, I missed like the first 15 minutes of the presentation, but did you happen to touch on the main restaurant where you did your studies, and did you perform at any other restaurants?
No, this study is strictly based on one restaurant.
So if you performed this survey or the study in a black restaurant in comparison to a white restaurant, would that have taken any toll on the research?
I mean, I don't necessarily think so, because this restaurant had a very diverse clientele. So it had roughly 50% black, 50% white clientele. So if you go that direction, then we run into the opposite problem we run into when trying to do this type of research in the suburbs, is you end up with a racially homogeneous sample in the opposite direction. So if you were to do this type of research in a restaurant that was primarily frequented only by African Americans, then you'd end up with an all-black sample. Make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why this restaurant was chosen strategically for that very purpose, is because it had a very diverse clientele, and I knew that I could get roughly 50-50. And that's what I was trying to do.
Where was it located?
We're located here in Detroit. And I just tell you all that because it's stupid to deny it, but. What else?
If you could ever get the university to give you enough money, maybe a situation like the Grand Hotel, where the premium there is the wait staff, who have been recruited over several generations in order, so there's a mystique there, it would be interesting. Now, I don't know if you'd get the kind of client mix, or a customer mix, but you could consume.
Right.
But that would be an interesting one, because in that situation, people go to that location precisely because of the type of wait staff that they have.
Right.
I don't know if people know that they're imported from some of the Caribbean countries, and they go and they live essentially over the summer up in the area, and then they leave, when the winter freezes over,
Really?
and so forth. But that's a real elite kind of thing, and that the people who are participate in that situation and have a real strong opinion, presumably, have a real strong opinion about those types of waiters and
Right.
what those waiters represent, both historically and in present day, you know, I mean, they're black. you
Right.
know.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Good cool.
And I'd help you if you get a chance to go to that restaurant.
I was just gonna say, I'm not sure if you were, keep in mind that, the racial bias implications could also apply to the quality proxies that you had.
That's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. That's where I want to go. So you're basically, what you're suggesting is that, correct me if I'm wrong, I cut you off, but are you suggesting that by asking them about the race of their servers, it was sensitizing them to the issue of race?
You have an opposite effect. Let's say somebody had, some rooted racism, learned behavior that they've had, and they wanted to counteract that by, giving them good ratings. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and my response to that is twofold. So we also looked at whether customers' race interacted with servers' race to predict these service behaviors, right? So if there was an interaction, that would otherwise allow us to identify whether there was same race bias or possibly whether there was opposite race bias. So do blacks have a bias for white servers, right?
Vice versa.
Or vice versa, and we didn't find any support for that, so there wasn't any significant interactions that we documented. But the Lynn et al. Earlier study did find some evidence of opposite race bias among African Americans. We weren't able to replicate that in this particular study, so the effect's still kind of questionable. But on the other front, what I was going to say is that what I thought you were going with it particularly is that by asking people to report their server's race, that immediately might have sensitized them to the fact that this was a race study, and given the desire to be perceived as non-racist or non-biased, even if you are racist or biased, might have driven customers to report that black servers were better than they actually were perceived to be. Follow me? And I can't unequivocally refute that critique. That's a problem that you deal with when you do survey research pertaining to race. But what we did do is we put one of the service measures prior to the race question, and then the other two after the race question. And so this service quality measure here was prior to the race question, and these two were after the race question. And this is a different scale than these two, but if you compare the nature of the effect, they're almost identical. So people were reporting black servers to be better than white servers even before being sensitized to the fact that this was a race study. That's a good question, good point.
Could you have avoided that by looking at the assignment of staff, you know, physically?
Yeah, and me identifying?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult because the restaurant where I did the research was gracious enough to let me solicit participation, but they didn't want me being in the way in the restaurant. So I had to collect data outside the restaurant, and by the time they got outside, I had no idea what their server was. So I had to ask them the race of their server.
But up front, if you could have gotten them to tell you where wait staff were assigned,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and then all you needed to know something about was where they sat,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, that was an idea. That's definitely something that I have to think about. Logistically, I don't know how easy it would be because they change sections so much, and it would also, again, require me to be more involved in the restaurant. And I intentionally refrain from interacting with the restaurant as much as possible because I didn't want to know the servers, and I didn't want to have any type of indication that I was working for the restaurant. But that's an idea.
What if you, I understand these restaurants are for-profit companies, they're not really interested in your research, but sort of if you gave the server a code of some sort, or maybe had the server hand, the survey envelope with the mailing address, And then not only could you verify the server characteristics, you wouldn't even have to ask, but you could control for more objective
Yeah.
measures of server quality, how long they've been working there, experience serving, maybe some sort of performance evaluation, so it wasn't just,
Right.
the customer's perception of the service quality.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. They, again, you kind of run into the issue though.
They don't
that
really
you-
want the server handing them
you
serving,
be-
right? Yeah.
And you become perceived, the survey is perceived to be administered by the
Mhm.
restaurant,
Yeah.
not an external researcher.
Yeah.
So the restaurant was very clear that they didn't want me giving the impression that the restaurant was surveying them.
Mhm.
So I had a little spiel that I give them. Usually I got the hand, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
Before I could get my spiel out. No thanks. All right, thank you all for coming.